afternoon and welcome to the Rocket Report this week. This week we have Dr. Perez. She is our Director of Special Services in Robinson ISD, and she's going to talk to us today about 504. So can you tell us what is 504?
Well, 504 is actually a section of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So it is a set of services that are from the federal government. It's ruled by the federal government, where students are allowed to have services to support them if they're identified as a student with a disability.
So what does it mean to be a student that is 504?
So if you're identified as 504, that means that you've gone through quite a lengthy process. So the process, there are 4 steps to the process of being identified as 504. You've got to be referred. You can be referred by a parent or an educator or a teacher. And then after you're referred, an evaluation has to be completed, and then you have to be determined eligible. And in order to be eligible as a 504 identified student, you have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Some people would call that the 2-prong test. So it's a physical or mental disability that substantially limits a major life activity. And then after the evaluation and the determination of eligibility, the 3rd step in the process is we develop what we call a 504 plan, if you're determined eligible. Then the 4th step is that we monitor that plan on a regular basis.
So you mentioned a major physical or mental disability that alters a major life function.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Physical or mental impairment, there is no exhaustive list, but the regs do define a physical or mental impairment as, and I'm going to read the definition, a physiological disorder or condition, a cosmetic disfigurement, or anatomical loss affecting one or more body systems. So that's an example of a physical impairment. Mental impairment could be, as self-explanatory, anything that is challenging where we have a mental diagnosis or anything that is affecting their mental capability. Major life activity is another area that there's no exhaustive list of what that is, but it includes things like hearing, walking, learning, speaking. I mean, it truly is major life activity.
So is there anything that would determine a student to be automatically eligible for 504 services?
No, there's nothing that determines that a child would automatically be identified as a child with 504. You have to be identified as the result of an evaluation.
So what about a student that might have a medical doctor documentation or medication?
That's great information for us to have. The 504 committee that does the evaluation has to consider various sources of information, and that doctor's information is important for that committee to consider, but it does not mean automatic eligibility.
So, and then what is the process once a student is determined to be eligible? What does that mean?
That means we're going to have a 504 meeting, and at that meeting we will have the 504 coordinator, which in Robinson is our counselors, and then we will have at least one of the child's teachers, and then the parents also invited to that committee, and at that meeting we will develop services. Typical services include what we call an accommodation plan, and that is a plan of instructional and/or STAR accommodations that support that student's success in school. It's very common to hear people say 504 levels the playing field. So what that means is that accommodation plan is not intended to give that student a privilege or an advantage. It simply is a plan of accommodations to accommodate for their identified disability so they have the same chances of learning at school as students without disabilities, and to be sure we're not discriminating against them based on their identified disability.
So if a student is identified and you've had the meeting and stuff, what does that mean going forward for that student on an annual basis?
Well, we typically review plans every year, and students have to have a reevaluation routinely. We typically follow the special ed guideline and do that reevaluation every 3 years. But you could expect to have a 504 meeting at least annually, but a meeting can be called by a teacher or a parent to review the plan and make sure it's still appropriate, because students are going to change, students are going to grow, and students are going to learn. So those accommodations, once they're put in place, they're going to need to change as that child develops.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this important information for parents. And again, if you have any questions, you may contact your child's counselor at each campus, and or Dr. Perez is always happy to answer any questions that you might have. Have a great week.